Nurse Walsh's generation mistakes years of service for actual competence. That is what Dr. Pierce said 17 minutes before the entire hospital watched him destroy his career on live television. But Margaret didn't know that yet. She was standing 3 feet away, holding a patient chart, her face a mask of practiced indifference, while 30 residents turned to stare at her like she was a teaching cadaver. The words hung in the fluorescent bright morning air of Cedar Creek Medical's ICU wing, suspended between cruelty and clinical observation, and Margaret simply continued documenting vitals. Pulse 78. Blood pressure stable. O2 sat 94%. The machines beeped their steady rhythm around her, oblivious to the fact that a man in a white coat had just publicly declared her professionally obsolete. Cedar Creek Medical in Atlanta hums with a particular frequency that only night shift nurses recognize, the sound of a building keeping people alive when the city sleeps. Antiseptic and old coffee and something else, something like the metallic tang of human fragility. Margaret Walsh moved through the ICU at 3 in the morning the way some people move through prayer, with reverence and absolute precision. 62 years old. Weathered hands scarred across the knuckles from a life spent holding other people's emergencies. Her movements were economical, efficient, the kind of economy that came from doing the same critical thing 10,000 times. Check the line. Verify the drip rate. Listen to the lungs. Watch the monitor. Write it down. Move to the next bed. She spoke only when necessary, her voice low and controlled like someone who had learned long ago that volume was the refuge of people who had nothing important to say. Other nurses deferred to her instinctively, though Margaret held no official supervisory rank. They simply knew. The way a school of fish knows where the current flows. When Margaret said, "I'll take that patient," they didn't argue. When Margaret corrected a medication calculation, the resident didn't ask why, they simply rechecked their math and found their mistake. She never raised her voice. She never had to. There was something in her presence, something like the calm that settles over people who have already survived the worst that could happen to them, and there was nothing left to fear. The staff locker room was quiet at 2:08 a.m. Margaret opened her locker, blue door, number 447, same locker for 6 years, and there it hung, a single dog tag on a broken chain, the kind of artifact that didn't belong in a civilian hospital. The name on it was worn nearly smooth from age and handling. Not her name. She touched it once, her scarred fingers trembling for a fraction of a second before she made a fist and the tremor stopped. That was the only place it ever happened anymore, that involuntary response to a dead man's name. In public, her hands were steady as a surgical laser. In the locker room, alone, she allowed herself 30 seconds of something that might have been grief or might have been rage or might have been the thing that lived underneath both. She closed the locker. The sound of metal against metal echoed in the empty room like a door slamming on a chapter no one was supposed to know about. Dr. Richard Pierce arrived for morning rounds at 6:15 a.m., his shoes polished to a mirror shine, his credentials visible on his badge-like armor. He was young for a chief of surgery, 44, which meant he'd clawed his way up through excellence or connections or, most likely, both. Yale Medical, Johns Hopkins residency, fellowship at Massachusetts General. His white coat fit him like something that cost money, and his eyes had the particular brightness of people who had never failed at anything that mattered. He represented everything that Cedar Creek's administration had decided the hospital needed: modern protocols, aggressive restructuring, the elimination of what he called institutional dead weight. Margaret represented the opposite. 23 years at Cedar Creek Medical. Night shift ICU nurse. Never promoted beyond staff level. Never published a paper. Never sought administrative advancement. Just a woman who showed up at 11 at night and kept people alive until the morning shift arrived, and did it with such unremarkable competence that no one thought to question whether she knew something the younger staff didn't. Dr. Pierce had decided she was the perfect example. A cautionary tale about what happened when hospitals tolerated complacency disguised as experience. The grand rounds began in the teaching conference room on the 4th floor, the one with the long table and the monitors displaying patient cases in real time. 30 residents circled the table, their notebooks open, their pens poised. Dr. Pierce stood at the head of the conference table, his posture suggesting he was about to deliver something profound. Margaret was there because one of the patients being discussed, a 58-year-old man with septic shock, was on her unit. She stood against the back wall, holding the patient chart, her grey-streaked hair pulled back in a bun, her expression neutral as a stone. This patient presented with a fever of 103.4 degrees, Pierce began, and Margaret noted he'd rounded down from 103.7. A small lie, but a lie nonetheless. The night nurse missed the early signs of deterioration in the first 4 hours. Fortunately, I caught it during morning rounds. Margaret watched his face as he spoke. There was no malice in his expression, which somehow made it worse. He actually believed what he was saying. He believed that the careful documentation of vitals she'd recorded at 2 a.m., flagging the patient's declining urine output and subtle mental status change, was somehow invisible to her because of her age. This is what happens, Pierce continued, turning to address the residents directly, when you have staff members whose clinical judgment has been eroded by decades of pattern recognition rather than actual critical thinking. Nurse Walsh's generation mistakes years of service for actual competence, and they cling to outdated protocols that waste hospital resources. 17 minutes. That's how long Margaret stood there while 30 sets of eyes tracked between her and Pierce, waiting for her to respond, to defend herself, to show some sign of the anger they all assumed she felt. She simply continued updating the chart. Vital stable. Urine output improved. Mental status clear. The machines around them beeped their steady rhythm, indifferent to institutional politics. One of the younger residents, a woman named Jen, probably 28, probably brilliant, probably too new to understand that her mentor had just used a patient's care as a prop for his own career, looked at Margaret with what might have been apology. Margaret didn't acknowledge it. She turned the page of the chart and made a note about the patient's latest lab work. The vending machine incident happened at 7:42 a.m., in the corridor outside the ICU, beside the water cooler that someone had been promising to clean for 3 weeks. Pierce was standing there with an intern. The kid looked terrified, the way interns looked when they were still learning that doctors said terrible things casually, like commenting on the weather. Margaret was retrieving a bottle of water because she'd been on her feet for 8 hours and her back was sending messages that only caffeine could answer. She wasn't trying to overhear the conversation. The corridor just wasn't that long. Honestly, that's why we need mandatory retirement at 60, Pierce was saying, his voice pitched low enough that he might have believed he was having a private conversation. The cognitive decline accelerates after that age. It's not a judgment, it's neuroscience. These people think they're being helpful, but they're really just slowing down the institution. They should go home, spend time with their grandchildren, volunteer at a nursing home if they want to feel useful. Not clinging to positions they're neurologically incapable of performing at an acceptable level anymore. The intern's eyes went wide because someone was standing directly behind them. Margaret had moved without making a sound, the way people who've trained themselves to be invisible learn to do. She was holding the water bottle, her weathered hand steady, her face composed. Pierce turned and saw her, and for a fraction of a second, maybe half a second, maybe less, his expression registered genuine surprise that he'd been caught. Then his smile returned, broader than before, the smile of a man confident in his righteousness. "Margaret, hello," he said, using her first name the way people use first names to diminish someone. "We were just discussing workforce optimization." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. It was so complete you could hear the ice machine humming 2 floors below, the distant announcement of a code blue in another unit, the ventilator in room for 12 cycling its mechanical breath. Margaret looked at him with eyes the color of winter stone, and what she said next emerged in a voice so quiet that the intern had to lean forward to hear it. "Your father would be ashamed of the doctor you became." She said it like she knew something. Like she'd met his father, or seen his medical school application, or had access to some catalogue of Dr. Pierce's professional choices that he would have preferred to remain private. The truth was she'd never met his father. But Margaret had learned, years ago, that the most effective weapon in the world was the appearance of knowledge. The implication that you knew more than you were saying. The suggestion that your restraint was the only thing keeping you from speaking something that would be devastating. Pierce's smile faltered. His jaw tightened. The color in his face shifted from its normal pale perfection toward something closer to embarrassment. The intern, watching this interaction, seemed to realize for the first time that the older nurse wasn't as harmless as her deferential silence had suggested. Margaret turned and walked away, her footsteps barely audible on the tile floor, leaving Pierce standing there with his professional credentials and his modern protocols and his absolute certainty about the decline of institutional medicine, looking like someone who had just been confronted with a truth he couldn't articulate or refute. She left the water bottle on the counter untouched. What Margaret didn't know as she returned to her unit, didn't know as she completed her shift notes and clocked out at 7:15 a.m., didn't know as she drove through Atlanta traffic on I-75 with the radio playing something nobody remembered, was that her 12 hours had been prelude. Her conversation with Pierce, which she already half regretted because self-defense violated her cardinal rule of invisibility, had documented nothing. The real crisis was still 8 hours away. And it would arrive in the form of a Navy SEAL commander with a surgical incision that was about to kill him, and the moment Margaret chose to save his life, everything she had spent 23 years building, the invisibility, the discretion, the careful erasure of Captain Margaret Walsh, Navy Medical Corps, would collapse like a house built on water. But first, that evening, she would open her locker and stare at the dog tag for longer than she should, because the admission sheet that came across her desk at 11:13 p.m. bore the name Commander Nathan Hayes, and Nathan Hayes had been Michael's commanding officer in Fallujah, the man who had promised to bring her son home, the man whose survival might be the only miracle left in her inventory. The admission came through at 11:13 p.m., and Margaret's hand stilled over the keyboard the moment she read the name. Commander Nathan Hayes. SEAL Team 3. Transferred from Emory via emergency transport, ruptured spleen, internal hemorrhage, post-op monitoring required. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above her head, indifferent to the way her breath had caught in her chest like a fist closing around her throat. 23 years. 23 years of keeping her head down, moving through Cedar Creek Medical like a ghost in scrubs, and the universe had decided to send her a phantom from 2004. The same man who had stood in desert fatigues in front of a field hospital in Fallujah, his voice steady and commanding, "I'll bring Michael home. You have my word." He hadn't. Michael had come home in a flag-draped box instead, and Nathan Hayes had disappeared into the classified machinery of the military, one more SEAL consumed by the war that never really ended. Margaret's locker sat in the break room, buried in the back corner where no one asked questions. She had opened it during her shift, stared at the dog tag hanging from its broken chain, Michael's name engraved in the metal, worn smooth by 17 years of her touching it, pressing it into her palm like a prayer she no longer believed in. The admission sheet had come across her desk 3 hours ago. She had felt the moment it registered in her nervous system, a flutter of something between dread and purpose, the way a dog's ears rise at a frequency humans shouldn't be able to hear. This man had promised. This man had failed. And now he was in bed 7 of her ICU, sedated and vulnerable, his chart listing him as high risk, requiring hourly monitoring, and she had volunteered for his care before she even understood why her mouth was moving. The charge nurse, Janet, had looked up from the assignment board with knowing eyes, not knowing, exactly, but the kind of knowing that comes from working with someone for 6 years, from watching patterns. "You sure about this one, Margaret? He's got a lot of notoriety." Margaret had simply nodded, her voice steady as ice water. "He's my patient." That was all it had taken. Janet had made the assignment, understanding that some requests carried a weight that didn't need explanation. Bed 7 was quiet. The machines around Hayes maintained their steady rhythm, ventilator hissing, heart monitor beeping in its regular pattern, for pumps clicking softly as they delivered measured doses of sedation and pain management. He was a man in his late 40s, scarred across the shoulders and chest in ways that spoke of violence survived, his dark hair streaked with grey that hadn't been there during Fallujah. Margaret had looked at his face for exactly 4 seconds before she forced herself to turn away and begin her checks, vital signs, dressing inspection, for patency, medication verification. The work was automatic, muscle memory moving her hands while her mind fractured across 17 years and 5,000 miles. His blood pressure was stable. Oxygen saturation steady at 97%. The post-operative labs from Emory had been clean, spleen removal, straightforward procedure, minimal complications during surgery. He should recover fine. He would recover, probably. He would go back to whatever SEAL Team Charlie was doing now, back to the world of classified operations and unmarked missions, and Margaret would return to being invisible, to pushing paper and hanging 4 bags in a hospital where nobody asked about the scars on her hands or the way she could perform emergency tracheotomies in the dark. The ICU corridor stretched out behind her in fluorescent-lit silence. Margaret moved through it like she always did, with the economy of motion that Pierce had once tried to pathologize as laziness. She didn't know then that he was documenting everything, taking notes on her efficiency, her competence, her refusal to perform urgency for an audience. The coffee in the break room had been made 6 hours ago. She poured a cup anyway, needing the routine of holding something warm, of doing something normal while her nervous system recalibrated to the presence of Nathan Hayes in bed 7. That was when Pierce found her. He appeared in the break room doorway with the certainty of a man who had already decided the shape of the conversation, his tablet tucked under one arm like a general carrying battle plans. His eyes moved across her face with the calculation of someone searching for weakness, and Margaret watched him catalogue the slight tension around her mouth, the way her hand wasn't quite steady on the coffee cup. She could see him making his assessment, weaving the threads together, connecting the dots that had nothing to do with competence or protocol. Isn't Commander Hayes a bit high profile for the night shift? Pierce's voice had that careful quality, the tone of a man asking a question whose answer he had already decided. Seems like maybe someone with your tenure would want to let the newer nurses gain experience. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She took a sip of the coffee, which tasted like a heating element and regret. When she finally turned to face him, her expression was perfectly neutral, the kind of flatness that came from learning to survive in hostile environments. "He's my patient," she said. 4 words. No explanation. No defensiveness. Just fact, stated as simply as a vital sign. Pierce's smile was the smile of a man who had just collected a piece of evidence. Of course. Just thinking about objectivity. Patient care can be compromised when there's a personal connection. He made a note on his tablet, the stylus moving with deliberate precision. Just something to document. He left the break room with the satisfied air of someone who had found exactly what he had been looking for. Margaret stood very still, her knuckles white around the coffee cup. The break room smelled like old coffee and the industrial-strength disinfectant they used on the counters, a smell that had soaked into her clothes and hair after 6 years of night shifts. She could hear the ventilators from the ICU beyond the glass partition, the soft hiss of oxygen being forced into lungs that couldn't manage on their own. The reassignment request would be on the chief's desk by morning. She could feel it the way animals feel the pressure change before a storm. Pierce had his documentation now. He had her reaction, her emotional response, her willingness to advocate for a specific patient. In his interpretation, it would look like bias. In her interpretation, it looked like keeping a promise to a dead man, fulfilling a duty that had been suspended for 17 years but never actually discharged. Margaret finished the coffee and rinsed the cup under water that ran too hot, watching the steam rise. The ICU beyond the window was a landscape of monitors and machines, each bed containing a small tragedy, each patient a problem to be solved through protocol and precision and the kind of detached compassion that kept you functional. She had learned that lesson in Fallujah, in a field hospital where the electricity ran on generators and the floors were concrete and the definition of triage involved choosing which lives you had the resources to try to save. That knowledge had followed her home, embedded itself in her bones, made her a good nurse and an invisible one. But invisibility had its limits. Promises had a half-life measured in years and guilt, in the space between what you said you would do and what you actually managed to accomplish. Hayes had promised Michael's mother he would bring her son home. Margaret had promised herself that if she ever saw Nathan Hayes again, she would repay that debt in the only currency she had, the skill of her hands, the knowledge of her body, the capacity to keep someone alive when death was negotiating at the door. She moved back through the ICU, past the nurse's station where Janet was reviewing charts, past the rooms where monitors beeped their electronic rhythm, steady and indifferent. Bed 7 was exactly where she had left it. Hayes was still sedated, still unaware that the woman standing in his doorway had carried his name in her locker for 17 years, had whispered it like a prayer and like a curse, had waited in the way that people wait when they know something is coming but can't quite see its shape. Margaret stepped into the room and began her checks. 1 hour vitals were due. She recorded blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen saturation, temperature. The chart noted no complications, no signs of post-operative bleeding, no concerning trends. Everything was proceeding according to the algorithm, the way medicine worked, when the human body cooperated with intervention and protocol and the decisions made in operating rooms. She adjusted the 4-pump, verified medication doses, and checked the dressing on his surgical site: clean, dry, no drainage, no signs of infection. The dog tag was in her pocket. She had transferred it there when she came back from the break room, moving on instinct older than conscious thought. Michael's name was engraved on the metal. Michael Walsh. Born 1982, died 2004. The dates were separated by 22 years, which made him older than she had been when she married his father, younger than she had been when she enlisted. She had carried him in her body, delivered him into the world, and then watched him grow into something she couldn't protect from the machinery of war and the promises of men like Nathan Hayes. She would keep him alive. It was the only promise left that she still had the capacity to fulfill. The documentation Pierce would file in the morning could say whatever it needed to say about emotional compromise and objectivity and the danger of personal connection. Margaret had learned in Fallujah that objectivity was a luxury reserved for people who didn't actually care about the outcome, and she had spent the last 17 years proving that she was capable of caring about outcomes in ways that transcended the formal structures of professional distance. Hayes would recover. She would ensure it, through vigilance, through skill, through the kind of relentless attention that Pierce would interpret as bias but which was actually something else entirely. Something older. Something with roots that went back to blood and oath and the particular fury of a woman who had already lost everything and was not, under any circumstances, going to lose anything again. The ICU settled into its night rhythm around her. The machines hummed and beeped and hissed. The fluorescent lights created a space where time moved differently, where the normal rules of outside didn't apply, where you could preserve a life if you were careful and competent and willing to do whatever was required. Margaret pulled up Hayes's chart on the computer and began reading his admission history, looking for the information that Pierce's reassignment would deny her access to tomorrow morning. But that wasn't the problem anymore. The reassignment was coming. The documentation was being gathered. The machinery of Pierce's ambition was already in motion. What mattered now was the next 12 hours, and then the 12 after that, and then the 12 after that, until Nathan Hayes was discharged or transferred or until Margaret had exhausted her capacity to influence his care. She had survived worse. She would survive this. She had survived Fallujah. She had survived losing Michael. She had survived 17 years of invisibility. She would survive whatever came next. The reassignment order was printed on pale blue paper, the kind Pierce used for all his official weapons. Margaret read it once in the pre-dawn darkness of the ICU, standing at the med station with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Effective immediately. Concern about objectivity. Patient care compromised by personal connection. The words were precise, legal, bloodless. She folded the paper in half. Then in half again. The creases were sharp as knife edges. Pierce appeared at 6:53 a.m., exactly when the night shift was ending and the day shift wasn't fully present yet. Strategic timing. He wore his white coat like armor, his tablet tucked under one arm, pen already positioned in his shirt pocket like a weapon he might need to draw. Behind him stood the charge nurse, Linda, with the expression of someone who had been told to bear witness. "Nurse Walsh," he said. "Not Margaret. Never Margaret. Your assignment to Commander Hayes has been reassigned effective this moment. You'll transition care to Patricia from the day shift. I'm sure you understand the hospital's concern about maintaining professional boundaries." Margaret didn't look at him. She was watching Hayes through the glass partition of his ICU bay, the man's chest rising and falling beneath a thin white blanket, monitors casting their green glow across his face. His oxygen saturation had been running 94 to 96% all night. Stable. His blood pressure had dipped once around 2 a.m., but it recovered. The arterial line was holding steady. Everything that could be measured was fine. No, Margaret said. Pierce's eyebrows lifted. The smile came, that particular smile that appeared when he thought he had caught someone in an act of defiance he could weaponize. I'm sorry. No, Margaret said again. She set the coffee cup down with deliberate care, watching the brown liquid settle. I'm staying on his case. Nurse Walsh, this isn't a request. His voice had taken on that particular timbre, the one he used during grand rounds when he was performing for residents. This is a direct order. You will step away from this patient's care immediately, or I will have security escort you from this unit. Margaret looked at him for the first time. Really looked. Took in the flush creeping up his neck, the way his jaw clenched when she didn't flinch. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. She had survived 17 years of invisibility. She could survive this. No, she said. A single word, flat as concrete. You're finished here, Walsh. She turned back to her coffee. The cup was still warm enough to drink. She took a sip, slow and deliberate, and she watched him in the corner of her eye as his face darkened 3 shades. He spun back toward the door, his tablet already out, his pen moving. Documenting. Collecting ammunition. Behind him, Linda looked like she wanted to disappear into the linoleum. Don't call security, Margaret said quietly. You want a civilian witness to your power play. You need her to see this. So don't. She turned to face him directly. I'm staying. You're going to watch me stay. And you're going to document that too. Something flickered across Pierce's face, not quite anger, not quite fear. The look of a man who had expected compliance and found something else entirely. He left without another word, but Margaret heard the pen scratching across the tablet screen as he walked, heard the charge nurse exhale like she had been holding her breath underwater. 2 hours. That was the window before the day shift took over completely, before Patricia would officially be assigned to Hayes and Margaret's presence would become optional. 2 hours to watch, to monitor, to be present. The night shift had been uneventful. Hayes had slept most of it, his monitors steady, his surgical dressings dry. The orthopedic surgeon had closed him efficiently 6 hours ago. Routine cardiac bypass, they said, though Margaret had seen the slight hesitation when the attending looked at the vessel repair, that microsecond pause that meant something wasn't quite right. But the TE showed good flow. The echo looked clean. On paper, Hayes was healing. Margaret changed his fob bag at 7:15. The line was running clear, no signs of infiltration. She adjusted his oxygen to keep him at 96, right where he liked it. She checked his dressings, and that was when she felt it, a warmth radiating from beneath the sterile gauze that shouldn't have been there. She lifted the edge of the tape with gloved fingers. The dressing underneath was staining. Not the bright red of fresh bleeding but the darker crimson of older blood, the kind that had been seeping for hours. She pulled the dressing back slowly, methodically, and saw it immediately. The suture line where the arterial repair had been reinforced was weeping. Not dramatically. Just a slow seep, the kind that might be attributed to normal post-op oozing. Except it wasn't. She had seen this in Fallujah. Seen it in a field surgeon's tent at 2 a.m. when a Humvee driver's femoral artery repair started weeping 6 hours post-op, seen it progress from a slow seep to catastrophic hemorrhage in 30 minutes. The body's way of rejecting what had been sown, not with drama, but with the patient persistence of physics. Margaret pulled the call light once. Then again. Patricia appeared in Hayes's doorway looking harried, already juggling 3 other patients. His dressing, Margaret said, needs fresh gauze and a higher level of observation. There's seepage along the anterior closure. Patricia looked at the site, shrugged. Looks normal. Post-op oozing. I'll document it and watch it. Watch it closer, Margaret said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Pierce materialized 20 minutes later in the hallway. He had clearly been lurking, waiting, ready to pounce on any sign of Margaret overstepping. He saw her emerging from Hayes's room and his eyes narrowed. Still here, I see. Disobeying direct orders. That's going to look wonderful in the board meeting. His dressing's weeping, Margaret said. Arterial repair. It needs. Thank you for the update, Pierce cut in. I'll review it with Patricia, the actual assigned nurse. He turned to leave, then paused. I hope Hayes's surgery was worth your career, Nurse Walsh. I really do. She didn't respond. Just watched him walk away, tablet already out, already documenting her insubordination, her boundary violations, her emotional compromise. He was building a case brick by brick, and she was handing him the mortar. But Hayes's dressing was still weeping at 8:11 a.m. Margaret could see it from the med station, could feel the wrongness of it in her bones the way only experience could teach. 30 minutes until shift change. 30 minutes until Patricia took over and Margaret became irrelevant. 30 minutes until whatever was happening inside Hayes's chest cavity became officially someone else's problem. The monitors looked perfect. Heart rate 72. Blood pressure 118/76. Oxygen saturation 97. Everything that could be displayed on a screen suggested a man recovering normally from cardiothoracic surgery. But the dressing was weeping. And Margaret had learned long ago that the body kept secrets the machines couldn't measure. She was checking his for fluids one final time when it happened. No warning. No gradual deterioration. Just an alarm, sharp and primal, as his monitor spiked into tachycardia. His heart rate jumped from 72 to 142 in the space of 2 seconds. His blood pressure dropped like a stone falling into dark water. 110/98. 84, falling. She reached for the call light, but her eyes were already on his chest, already seeing what was happening underneath the blanket. The dressing erupted red. Not seeping. Hemorrhaging. A volcano of blood that meant the arterial tear had finally given way completely, that the sutures had failed under the pressure of his own heartbeat, that he was bleeding out internally at a rate that would kill him in 90 seconds. Code blue, someone screamed. Patricia had seen it too, had pressed her own call light, and now alarms were screaming from 3 different machines, their voices layering into a single discordant howl. Hayes's lips were turning blue. His skin was going pale, the flush of life draining away second by second. The code team was 2 floors down. They would need 90 seconds minimum to reach the ICU. Hayes had 30. Maybe less. Margaret's hands moved. She didn't think. Didn't hesitate. The muscle memory took over, 18 years of it compressed into pure instinct. She grabbed the crash cart, positioned it, and in one fluid motion she placed her interlocked hands on Hayes's sternum and pressed down with all her weight. The bone cracked, a sound like breaking a stick of dry wood, and she felt the give beneath her palms as she cracked his chest open manually, as she breached the sternum and pulled the ribcage apart wide enough to see inside. There. The arterial repair, torn wide. Blood pooling in the pericardium. She didn't reach for instruments. She reached into his chest cavity with her gloved hand and found the artery, found where it had separated from its suture line, found the bleeding point and compressed it between her fingers and the roof of his chest wall. 14-gauge angiocath, she said. Her voice was different now, not asking, not requesting. Commanding. Stating facts. Level 1 rapid infuser. 2 units whole blood, stat. Get me 1 milligram epi ready for push. Patricia stood frozen, her hands at her sides. Now, Margaret said. The word had the weight of 17 years behind it. 17 years of invisibility. 17 years of deference and compliance and keeping her head down. The word came out like a tank idling in a garage, like something that had been dormant and was now fully awake and fully weaponized. Patricia moved. The trauma tech moved. Even the resident who appeared in the doorway moved, stepping back to make space for the surgeon who was standing in Hayes's open chest cavity, her hand holding his life together literally, her eyes steady as surgical lasers. Pierce appeared in the doorway, his tablet raised, his pen already moving. Documenting. Recording. Collecting evidence that would destroy her. Margaret didn't look at him. She was focused entirely on the bleed site, on keeping pressure on the artery, on the monitors where his oxygen saturation was climbing. 68, 72, 78, climbing. She could feel his heartbeat beneath her palm, weak, fluttering, but present. Still fighting. "Get me a satin sky clamp," she said. "Small. We're going to repair this in situ if we can stabilize him." The code team burst through the doors just as the rapid infuser came online, and for one moment, just one, nobody moved. They took in the scene, a nurse with her hand inside a man's chest, blood up to her wrist, her expression the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She didn't acknowledge them. Didn't explain. Didn't ask permission. "His pressure's climbing," she said. "Sinus rhythm. Get me those surgical trays. We're not going to the OR. We're doing this here." And that was when Pierce finally stepped back. When his pen stopped moving. When he realized, for the first time, that the woman he had been trying to destroy might be something he couldn't even begin to comprehend. Pierce didn't wait for the code team to clear the room. His tablet was already recording. The moment Margaret stepped back from Hayes's chest, her hands crimson, her breathing controlled, her voice still carrying that terrible authority, he began typing. His fingers moved with the precision of a man who had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. Unauthorized invasive procedure. Gross violation of scope of practice. He scrolled through his prepared documentation, each line already formatted, dated, ready. The phrases flowed like a script he had rehearsed in his mind 100 times. He had her now. By the time the surgical team took over, Dr. Chen staring at Margaret with something between awe and confusion, Pierce was already moving through the hallways with his phone pressed to his ear. The hospital's legal counsel picked up on the second ring. He didn't even say hello. "I'm filing an incident report. Unauthorized cardiac intervention. Unsupervised surgical procedure. I have witnesses and video documentation." The lawyer's voice crackled back, "That's serious. What's the scope violation?" Pierce smiled, that thin predatory smile that made residents instinctively step backward. 1987 Hospital Bylaw. Section 4.2. Unsupervised invasive procedures. It's a direct violation. She committed surgery without physician authorization. The lawyer hesitated for only a moment. "That code is actually been superseded in most. I'll handle the legal interpretation." Pierce cut him off. "Start drafting the termination paperwork." The administrative meeting happened in the Chief of Surgery's office at 4 p.m. Pierce entered carrying a 3-inch stack of documentation, the kind of stack that made administrative heart sink before it even hit the table. He had been saving for this. 7 months of documented concerns. A resident who claimed Margaret had overstepped her authority during a trauma case. A surgical tech who reported she had given direct orders to physicians in the OR. An anesthesiologist who noted in his records that Margaret had questioned clinical judgment during a crisis, which, Pierce had carefully highlighted in yellow, was inconsistent with proper nursing hierarchy. Each document was time-stamped. Each one had been carefully cultivated, nurtured, collected like evidence at a crime scene. The chief flipped through page after page, his face growing darker. "Dr. Pierce, some of these incidents seem routine. Are they routine when they culminate in an authorized cardiac surgery?" Pierce's voice was ice. She cracked open that patient's sternum with her bare hands. No physician order. No oversight. Pure insubordination dressed up as heroics. He spread out the 1987 hospital bylaw. The paper had yellowed with age, which made it perfect, ancient, official, dusty with authority. Section 4.2 was highlighted in surgical green. Unsupervised invasive procedures by nursing staff constitute a breach of medical chain of command and shall result in immediate suspension pending investigation. Pierce had read that bylaw 47 times. He had highlighted it until the words seemed to glow. She violated the chain of command, he said quietly. That makes her a liability. The chief looked at the paperwork, then at Pierce. We'll need to speak with her. Let her explain. Her explanation is that she performed surgery. Pierce's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Everything else is justification for insubordination. Margaret was called to the chief's office at 5:11 p.m. She knew before she opened the door. The waiting room had gone quiet in that specific way that meant something catastrophic had happened, the way crowds go silent when a car crashes. She walked into the office and saw her badge on the desk, next to a manila folder with her name typed in efficient black letters. She didn't sit down. She stood very still, the way a person stands when they're waiting for execution. The chief looked uncomfortable. Genuinely uncomfortable. He was a good man, Margaret knew. He had hired her 6 years ago. He knew her work. But he was looking at a 3-inch stack of documentation and a 1987 hospital bylaw, and he was looking at Dr. Pierce's face, which carried the immutable certainty of a man who had prepared for this moment with the dedication of a zealot. Margaret, the chief began. The incident report filed by Dr. Pierce raises serious concerns about scope of practice violations. The board has decided he didn't finish. He didn't need to. There was an employee separation agreement on the desk, pre-signed by the hospital's legal counsel. Margaret's name and employee ID already filled in. The only blank was the date. The chief filled it in as she watched, March 14, 2024. Today. You're suspended effective immediately, the chief said. His voice was small. Pending investigation. The termination paperwork is prepared. If the investigation corroborates the incident report, your employment will be terminated for cause. If it doesn't, he trailed off. Both of them knew how these investigations went. Your badge, he said quietly. Margaret reached down and picked up the badge. She held it for a moment. The laminated photograph showed a nurse in her mid-50s with steady eyes and iron-grey hair pulled back tight. She looked like someone who had seen things. She had. She set it back on the desk. Pierce was leaning against the wall in the hallway when she came out. His expression was one of studied concern, the face of a man who regretted difficult decisions. I'm sorry it came to this, he said. But patient safety. Margaret walked past him without stopping. She didn't look at him. She didn't speak. The silence she left behind was so complete that a nurse 3 doors down turned to check if there had been a power failure. Pierce watched her go, and his smile returned. He had built this perfectly. The documentation. The bylaw. The narrative of an aging nurse who had overstepped, who had stepped outside the chain of command, who had performed surgery without authorization. It was airtight. It was beautiful. It was done. The hospital laundry room smelled like bleach and heat. The industrial washers hummed in their rhythmic cycles, the sound like something mechanical giving birth to cleanliness. Margaret stood at the folding table with a stack of scrubs, her scrubs, the one she had worn for 6 years, washed and re-washed until the fabric had faded from true blue to something closer to the color of a sky that had given up hoping for rain. She picked up the first pair. The fabric was still warm from the dryer. She folded it with ritual precision, one length. Another length. The small deliberate movements of a person who understood that some gestures were the only prayer available. Her hands were clean now. She had scrubbed them under the sink in the break room, watching her own blood spiral down the drain like a question being answered. But she could still feel Hayes's heart under her palms. That flutter. That catch. That moment when electrical impulse became contractile force and a man came back from the edge of not being. She had done that. In Fallujah, she had done it 37 times in a single night. Under mortar fire. With equipment held together by tape and prayer. She had held a teenage Marine's heart in her hands and felt it restart like an engine being given a second chance. She had extracted a CIA asset from a collapsed field hospital, carrying him through streets that were essentially open-air kill zones, moving like smoke, existing in that thin space between detection and survival. And when it was over, when the operation was complete and classified and buried so deep it required a security clearance just to know it had happened, she had been ordered to disappear. Margaret Walsh didn't exist anymore. The captain had been scrubbed from official records. Her decorations had been sealed. The unit history had been revised. She had become just a nurse. That was the bargain. That was the price of the thing she had done, the thing that was never supposed to have happened, the thing that might have prevented something catastrophic or might have been nothing at all, because classified operations had a way of existing in Schrodinger's state, simultaneously necessary and never having occurred. She had been relieved to disappear, in a way. Relieved to fold herself into the quiet predictability of night shifts and patient charts and the long unremarkable competence that came from decades of training in skills that never appeared on any resume. She had worked at Cedar Creek for 6 years. She had kept her head down. She had never mentioned that the dog tag in her locker bore a name that wasn't hers. It bore the name of her son's commanding officer, the man who had promised to bring Michael home from Fallujah, the man she had held responsible with every fiber of her being until she had seen him in bed 7, and the weight of that promise had felt like the physical thing it was, gravity, unforgiving and absolute. She had thought she could stay disappeared. She had thought invisibility was a sustainable condition. But invisibility has a shelf life, and it had just expired. Margaret set the folded scrubs on the clean stack. She picked up the next pair. Her hands moved through the motions, fold, smooth, fold again, with the same precision she had used to open Hayes's chest cavity. The same precision she had used to compress his descending aorta. The same precision that had made a room full of surgeons step backward and let a nurse in a hospital gown take command of the space and the crisis and the mathematics of whether a man lived or died. The dog tag hung heavy around her neck. She had taken it off her locker chain this morning and threaded it through her scrub collar, where it sat against her collarbone like a heartbeat. Michael's dog tag. Michael's name. But it was Hayes's face she saw when she held it. Hayes's voice saying she ordered me to come home. Hayes's eyes in Fallujah when he realized that the Navy Medical Corps officer keeping his blood inside his body was his best friend's mother, the woman he had made a promise to in a desert that had long ago stopped listening to promises. She folded the last scrub. She smoothed it with the same hands that had held Hayes's heart. The hospital had taken her badge. Dr. Pierce had taken her position. The investigation would take her record. But he hadn't taken this, he couldn't take this, the knowledge that her hands knew how to save lives in ways that no hospital bylaw could quantify or control. That knowledge was inside her like shrapnel. It would always be there. Margaret picked up her scrubs, her old scrubs, 6 years of night shifts and ER crises and grief held in strict professional discipline, and carried them to the donation bin. She set them inside carefully, like laying something to rest. She turned off the laundry room lights. The fluorescent fixtures blinked off in sequence, leaving her standing in the dark for a moment before the emergency lights hummed to life. Everything in hospitals had a backup system. Everything except the people. She walked toward the staff exit. Her employee badge was already gone. Her name would be on a termination letter by morning. The investigation would proceed, and the outcome was already written in the neat documentation Dr. Pierce had prepared. But as she pushed through the doors into the Atlanta night, warm and humid and alive with the sound of distant traffic, she touched the dog tag under her shirt and felt something shift. Somewhere in her phone, a number existed that had been dialed only 3 times in 12 years. A Pentagon number. Direct line. The kind of number that opened doors that weren't supposed to exist. She had been ordered never to call it unless the operation came back online, unless something classified required her expertise, unless the thing that was supposed to stay buried came back to the surface. She hadn't called it yet. But standing in the parking lot at Cedar Creek Medical, watching the lit windows of the hospital where she had just been erased, Margaret considered that she might have been thinking about this wrong. Pierce hadn't destroyed her. He had freed her. She walked toward her car as the parking lot security lights hummed overhead like prayers waiting to be answered. The lobby of Cedar Creek Medical hummed with the ambient buzz of morning activity. Dr. Pierce stood near the information desk, adjusted his tie with the precision of a man who knew cameras were minutes away. Channel 7's production team had already set up, lights on tripods, a reporter checking her makeup in a compact mirror, someone arranging the backdrop to frame the hospital logo perfectly behind his shoulder. Pierce had spent 40 minutes on his opening statement about maintaining standards of care and protecting patient safety from unauthorized interventions. The words felt solid in his mouth. Rehearsed. He had already checked his reflection in the glass doors 6 times. The first television monitor flickered. Then the second. Then every screen in the lobby cut to the same feed simultaneously. Pentagon press conference. Live feed. A general stood at a podium, his face lined and weathered like old stone. Behind him, a SEAL team photo, faces blurred except one. On the right side of the screen, text scrolled, Navy SEAL Commander Hayes identifies life-saving nurse from Fallujah operation. Pierce's mouth went dry. Commander Nathan Hayes sat in dress blues, his chest a ribbon of medals, his voice steady as he spoke into a microphone. Captain Margaret Walsh saved my life not once but twice. In Fallujah. And in Cedar Creek Medical 3 days ago. She is the angel of Fallujah. She is a hero. And she should be celebrated, not suspended. The reporter stepped back from Pierce. Her earpiece crackled. She turned away from him to listen. On every monitor in the lobby, the Pentagon feed continued. A hospital chaplain stood now, Father Michael Donnelly, Cedar Creek's own chaplain, holding a printed unit history. His voice carried the weight of someone who had stood in war zones and counted bodies. I served as chaplain to her unit in Fallujah. In a single night, he paused, his eyes scanning the paper, in one night of mortar fire and chaos, Captain Walsh performed 37 combat surgeries. 37. Many were amputations. Field procedures. Soldiers who would have died in transport made it home because of her hands, her training, her refusal to quit. A sound escaped from Pierce's throat. A small, strangled thing. The chaplain continued. Her suspension from Cedar Creek Medical is an affront to service. To sacrifice. To honor. Patients in the lobby had stopped. The receptionist stood with her hand frozen on her mouse. Every face turned upward to the screens like prayer. Then an admiral. For stars. His dress uniform was so white it hurt to look at. His voice came like gravel scraped across concrete. I'm not here to discuss hospital policy. I'm here to discuss medals. He held up a small case. Bronze Star with Valor. A beat. The camera zoomed on the insignia. Silver Star. Another beat. A second Silver Star. Another. And the Navy Cross. The silence in the lobby was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights humming their electrical hymn. Those 4 decorations, the Admiral said, represent valor that most Americans will never understand. They represent willingness to die for strangers. Captain Walsh earned every one of them. She earned them while someone in that hospital lobby was worrying about his career trajectory. Pierce's phone began to vibrate. He didn't touch it. On screen, a figure appeared, partially shadowed, a State Department liaison. Captain Margaret Walsh's actual designation was Nightingale 6. She conducted extraction operations in collapsed field hospitals in Fallujah. She recovered a CIA asset whose intelligence prevented a catastrophic attack on American soil. Her medical records were sealed. Her service was classified. Her medals were hidden. And her sacrifice was erased to protect operations that officially never occurred. Someone in the lobby made a sound like a gasp. Or a prayer. She came home. She became a nurse at Cedar Creek Medical. She kept her head down. She asked for nothing. And then she saved a Navy SEAL commander, a direct subordinate of hers in theater, by performing open cardiac massage with her bare hands when he flatlined in her ICU. The liaison paused. The silence stretched. And for that act of heroism, she was suspended. The camera cut back to the Admiral. His jaw was locked. "I'd like to speak to the administrator of Cedar Creek Medical. And I'd like to know why we're persecuting our own." Then another voice, crisp, commanding, absolutely furious. A 4-star general, calling in live via satellite from somewhere Pierce couldn't identify. The general's face filled one monitor. His name appeared on the banner, General Marcus Hayes, Joint Special Operations Command. "I'm watching a doctor named Pierce try to defend policy violations while standing in front of a camera." The general's voice could have cut steel. "Let me be clear. This man just persecuted a Navy SEAL commander's life-saving physician. He persecuted a captain. He persecuted someone who has more valor in her pinky finger than he has in his entire body. So I have a question for Cedar Creek Medical. Why haven't you fired him yet?" The reporter's earpiece crackled again. She glanced at Pierce. Her expression had shifted. From deference to something else. Something like contempt. Pierce opened his mouth. Nothing emerged. The lobby was full now, and nurses from the ER had come down. ICU staff. Residents. They stood in clusters, watching the screens, watching Pierce, watching the slow-motion dissolution of his authority like a building collapsing in real time. The feed cut back to the Pentagon. The general was still there, still staring directly at the camera like he was staring directly at Pierce. This story goes viral in 3, 2, 1. It already had. The production team around Pierce was receiving feeds, 11 million views. Then 12. 17. The comments scrolling underneath the video moved too fast to read, but the words "national hero" and "disgrace" and "how dare you" appeared repeatedly before disappearing under the avalanche of new text. Pierce's phone vibrated again. And again. And again. The hospital administrator, CEO Rebecca Chen, emerged from the elevator. She was holding her own phone, her face pale. She walked directly past Pierce without looking at him. To the reporter. "We are implementing an immediate review of all disciplinary actions. All of them." She turned to the cameras. "And Dr. Pierce's employment status will be determined by this evening. We stand with Captain Walsh." That evening, the hospital board convened in emergency session. Rebecca Chen sat at the head of the table with a stack of documents. 43 pages. Printed. Hole-punched. Divided into 17 sections. 17 formal complaints filed against Nurse Margaret Walsh by Dr. Pierce over the course of 18 months, Chen read aloud. Her voice was measured. Clinical. Deadly. 17 complaints. Do any of you know how many complaints were filed against her by any other physician, nurse, administrator, or colleague in her 6 years at Cedar Creek? Silence. 0. None. Not a single one. Board member Dr. Rajesh Patel leaned forward. "What are the complaints about?" Chen opened the folder. Emotional compromise. Inappropriate familiarity with patients. Excessive independence. Unwillingness to defer to senior physicians. Speaking out of turn during rounds. She looked up. The final complaint was filed immediately after she saved a Navy SEAL commander from death. The complaint said she demonstrated gross overreach of scope by performing unauthorized invasive procedures. "That's not a complaint," said Patricia Morris, the board's legal representative. "That's a political move." What did she actually do? She performed open cardiac massage through direct arterial compression. The patient flatlined. The code team froze. She saved his life. Morris picked up the complaint. "Read it." Her expression hardened. The 1987 bylaw he cited was superseded in 2003. He invoked a dead law. Deliberately or through incompetence, he used an outdated regulation to justify removing her from care. Morris looked at Chen. "Who vetted his documentation?" "He did." Only he did. There's no peer review, no secondary verification. He compiled it himself over 18 months and then presented it as accumulated evidence. The room went silent. Morris continued reading. I'm seeing pattern manipulation here. Selective documentation. Context removal. He took normal clinical behaviors and reframed them as violations. She looked up. How many other staff members has he documented concerns about? Chen pulled out a second stack. This one was thicker. 17 other staff members. All women. All over 50. All minorities except one. All have either left Cedar Creek or filed their own complaints about his conduct. Dr. Michael Chen, the board chair, felt something shift in his chest like the sound of a lock clicking open. Get legal counsel on the line. I want to know if we have exposure. Within an hour, they had their answer. Massive exposure. Pattern exposure. Liability exposure. The kind that triggered mandatory reporting to state medical boards, to the Department of Health, to law enforcement. By the following morning, the State Medical Board of Georgia had opened an investigation into Dr. Pierce's conduct. The hospital suspended him pending review. His medical license was flagged. His malpractice insurance company began calculating their potential liability. Pierce sat in his house that evening, the television playing on mute. He watched the Pentagon footage loop, Margaret's face appearing in combat photos that had been classified until now. Young. Hard. Covered in blood that wasn't hers. Her hand steady on a soldier's open chest in the ruins of a bombed building. The caption read, Captain Margaret Walsh, Field Surgery Operations, Fallujah, 2006. She stared back at him from the screen with eyes that had seen things he couldn't imagine. She stared back at him from a war he had only read about. She stared back at him from a category of human experience so far above his that the distance felt like physics, like gravity itself pinning him to the ground. His phone rang. He didn't answer it. It rang again. And again. News outlets wanting statements. Colleagues backing away. His brother-in-law's administrative assistant calling to say the judge was not taking personal calls. His mother, crying. His ex-wife, asking if he had lost his mind. He watched the viral video again. His own face frozen in the moment he understood the magnitude of his error. 11 million people had watched him understand. 11 million people would remember him as the man who attacked a war hero. 6 months later, Margaret walked through Cedar Creek Medical's corridors in clean scrubs. Her badge read Clinical Director, Trauma Services. The lobby had changed. A wall now displayed photographs of Cedar Creek's most distinguished staff members. Her photo was center, in full navy dress blues, her medals visible, her expression calm and absolutely certain. Below it, Captain Margaret Walsh, Navy Medical Corps, retired, Trauma Services Director. Young nurses stopped her constantly. Captain Walsh, can you look at this case? Captain Walsh, can you mentor me? Captain Walsh, is it true you performed 37 surgeries in one night? She answered each question with the patience of someone who had been carrying the weight of secrets for a very long time and was finally allowed to set some down. Commander Hayes walked beside her on her morning rounds. His recovery had been textbook perfect, but only because Margaret had written the textbook. They stopped at the window overlooking the parking lot where she had walked 6 months ago, carrying the knowledge that her career had ended. Michael would be proud, Hayes said quietly. Margaret's hand touched the dog tag under her scrubs. The single dog tag on a broken chain. The one that bore Michael's name, not hers. He was your brother in arms. You're my family now. They walked in silence down the corridor. The hospital hummed around them, the steady rhythm of survival and recovery, the sound of people being brought back from the edge of nothing. It was a sound Margaret had learned to recognize in another lifetime, in a bombed building in Fallujah, with 37 soldiers depending on her hands. In a suburban strip mall across Atlanta, in a clinic that smelled like wet dog and antiseptic, Dr. Pierce stood at the front desk of Peachtree Animal Clinic. His medical license was suspended for 3 years pending completion of ethics training. His malpractice insurance had dropped him. His collegial network had evaporated like morning fog. He checked in a golden retriever with a limp. The owner barely looked at him. He had become invisible in exactly the way Margaret had once been invisible. The difference was that she had chosen it. She had worn invisibility like armor. She had used it to protect what mattered. He was simply erased. His hands shook as he typed the dog's information into the computer. These hands had once held a scalpel. Had once been respected. Now they trembled checking in cats and dogs for $18 an hour while the clinic manager watched him from across the room like a prison guard watching a minimum security inmate who had already proven capable of violence against the system. That evening, Margaret stood before a medical school auditorium at Emory. 200 students sat in the darkness, their faces lit by the glow of her presentation. She described field triage. How to make decisions when you have 10 patients and only one set of hands. How to choose who lives and who you'll carry in your mind forever. Medicine isn't about credentials or status, she said, her voice steady as stone. It's about the oath you take and the lives in your hands. Respect that oath more than you respect anything else. A student raised his hand. How did you stay calm under fire? Margaret considered the question. The dog tag caught light under her collar, a small glint of metal, a reminder of the cost of survival. Fear is useful. Panic kills. I chose which one served my patients. Outside the auditorium, Hayes waited by her car. He handed her an envelope. Inside was a photograph of Michael, young and smiling in dress blues, taken before Fallujah, before everything changed, before duty meant dying. Margaret's composure finally fractured. One tear, quickly wiped. She touched the photograph like it might dissolve. Thank you. Hayes saluted her. Crisp. Perfect. The salute of one professional to another. The salute of one warrior to a legend. She returned it, her hand steady, her movement exact. The salute of a captain to her sailor. The salute of someone who knew exactly what she had sacrificed and was finally, after 6 years of darkness, allowed to stand in the light. She drove home past Cedar Creek Medical, its windows blazing with light. In the glass, her reflection was steady. Unbroken. Captain Margaret Walsh, Navy Medical Corps, Clinical Director of Trauma Services, Angel of Fallujah, finally visible to a world that desperately needed to see her. If you've ever underestimated someone because of what they appeared to be, because of who they seemed, if you've ever judged the quiet person in the room, subscribe now. Like this video. Comment what you think Margaret's next chapter should be. Because sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. And sometimes they're standing right beside you, waiting for the world to catch up to who they've always been.